Let's look at some strategies for naming our actual Angular objects. When naming controllers, we have a couple of obvious options. The first is to just name the controller according to what makes sense to us. Of course, if you are using a namespacing prefix, then your name would also include that. Here, my schedule controller is just named schedule. This is simple and makes sense. The second option is to follow a convention often used by the Angular team and a lot of the Angular community, and suffix your controllers with CTRL. Any suffix will do the same thing, but CTRL is customary. When naming services, we basically have the same two options as controllers. Either name it what makes sense, or use a common suffix. SVC makes sense here, but anything else can work if you are consistent. For filters, again we have the same options as services and controllers. Directives are a little different than the previous three objects. As before, you can name a directive with a simple name, or you can use some kind of suffix. I wouldn't recommend dir. But there's a third option. Angular requires that you write out a directive in HTML using what they call snake case, or basically it's the camel-cased words separated out by dashes. Since that is a valid file name, you can name your file with the snake casing, but when you declare it in the directive, you will still need to use the camel casing. Partials, as Angular likes to call them, have another consideration. We don't have to name the object with Angular, we only have to name the file. The file name is how Angular identifies a particular partial. But what's unique about partials is that they often go hand in hand with either a controller or a directive. Rarely is the same partial used with more than one directive or controller. So we can do like I have shown here and just name the partial according to what makes sense, or we can try to match the name of the partial with the object for which it is the view. This has the benefit of when we are working with a directive or controller, we can more easily find the partial that belongs to it. In this case, if that schedule object was a controller and had a suffix of CTRL, we may or may not include that in the name of the partial. Now let's take everything we've discussed and put it together in a full naming convention. This particular convention may or may not resonate with you, but what's most important is to pick a naming convention and use it throughout your application. I will say that this naming convention is one that I have personally used in production on a huge project with over 100,000 lines of JavaScript, and it worked out really well for us. Here, I am dividing up my files into feature folders. I'm using a prefix so that I can namespace this feature and avoid naming collisions with objects in any other area of the application. Within my schedule feature, I have 6 files. Take a moment and look at those 6 files and see if you can tell what type of object each of them are. It should be fairly obvious. This concludes our module on organizing your code. I hope you have seen how important naming can be. It's an important concept in all programming, but specifically in Angular, the wrong name can quickly lead you down a path where your code becomes brittle and easily broken, and where you put your files and how you name them can have a significant effect on the maintainability of your code.